It's an enormous pleasure to be here this evening and to see so many people coming out on what's still quite a, I regret to say, cold season. Goodness knows what's going on with the weather and what's going on with the trains as well, because it was quite a challenge really to get here this evening. What should have been an easy journey straight from Waterloo past Salisbury up to Tisbury, wasn't possible because of a suspected gas leak, and that followed a train on the line, and then there I went to Paddington instead, and I thought this will be lovely, no problems with this journey up to Bath Spa, and it didn't move at the appointed hour, and would you believe it, an announcement followed pretty swiftly. We're waiting for the train manager who's got delayed. So here we are, despite all of this, and I'm really excited to find such a large group in a relatively small place. This is the centre of the world, I think, and this is the first place in which I'm giving this particular talk. And we talked about controversy. Well, obviously this place is no stranger to controversy, otherwise perhaps you wouldn't be wanting to hear the topic this evening: churches, cathedrals and synagogues, places of healing, not worship. So sit tight, lots of pictures, audio visual tonight. We've even got some music, which is a very important part of what we'll be saying. So I'll keep going. I think you'll find it, I hope you'll find it, as interesting as I found it doing the research over a number of years. What we're going to do this evening is we're going to apply our critical thinking. We're going to put our critical thinking hats on and ask ourselves, what were these extraordinary buildings originally? That's cathedrals, churches and synagogues. And a good place to start will be with etymologies. We'll dig into those. Then we'll follow a historical sequence. So we'll start with the synagogue, followed by cathedrals and churches. And looming not far behind will be the subject of Tartaria. How many people of you here tonight have heard of Tartaria? A lot of you. A lot of hands going up at this point. So we'll be asking, who were the real architects of these magnificent churches and cathedrals? And I'm going to add tonight the liturgical music played in those edifices. And then we'll wrap up with conclusions and questions.
Thank you.
So, all important questions tonight. The ladies in the room can put on their Sherlock Holmes hat, as can the men. And we're going on an exciting detective hunt, applying critical thinking. Einstein couldn't have put it better. Questioning everything. Einstein talked about the importance of literally questioning everything. And, well, I don't think we can necessarily expect to find answers from academia for what we're going to say tonight. In fact, I'm pretty sure that we can't, except perhaps from a couple of the articles that I wrote while I was still working in the mainstream academic system. And you can find copies of 2 articles that I wrote at the back. I only had 10 copies of each printed out. But if you're interested in finding out more about how a lot of truth is suppressed in academia, there's a book at the back written by The Secret Professor, published by Truth University Press. That's called The Dark Side of Academia. And it's dark because so much important information is suppressed within that system. And so what we're going to do tonight, as I say, is apply critical thinking. Here's a book on the screen, Light Bulb Moments and the Power of Critical Thinking. The journey we're going on tonight is nothing more than the application of critical thinking. And we can do this, all of us, in our day-to-day lives, with all the myriad topics that come our way. So let's begin applying our critical thinking skills with etymologies for these different terms. Ecclesia, that's the Latin word, if you like, for church, that comes from the Greek word meaning assembly or gathering, and we get the French word église, of course, from the Greek word ecclesia. And it's formed from two parts, from a prefix, ex, as in ecclesia, which means out of, and the second part, the ecclesia bit, comes from, it's thought, the verb kallio, to call. And so, in essence, the word ecclesia means a gathering of citizens called out from their homes, which is quite interesting if you ponder that. What cause could bring people to leave their homes, you might be asking yourself. And then we get to the cathedral. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the earliest evidence for the use of the word cathedral is in 1587, and that's in the writing of William Harrison. And now the word cathedral is used to describe the principal church that's found in a diocese, typically the home of a bishop or an archbishop. And, well, here's an alternative explanation to the etymology of the word cathedral, that it is somehow linked to the word cathode. Maybe some of you have come across this idea. A cathode being an electrode where electricity is given out or flows out. And the last part, the hedral, it could be defined as having a specific number of surfaces from which, if you like, the electricity is flowing out. So we've got very different etymologies here for cathedral, and maybe we can make sense of these differences later on in what's to come. And synagogue. What's the origin of the word synagogue? Well, this also has a Greek origin, comes from the word synagein, the verb meaning to bring together, and it's used rather like the church to refer to a place of assembly. And the word is thought to be a Greek translation of the Hebrew words bet knesset, meaning place of assembly. Now, according to a religious body, a current day religious body called Chabad, they are the orthodox end of things in the Jewish faith. Some of you may or may not be aware that there are several branches of Judaism. You've got the Orthodox at the extreme end, the Reform in the middle, and the Liberal at the other end, progressively less dictated by ritual and dogma. Now here's Chabad at the Orthodox end, stating that the purpose of the synagogue is to, quotes, provide a venue to facilitate and enhance the biblical obligation of prayer by adding a communal element to that. So according to Chabad, the synagogue was a place of prayer. Is this view historically correct? This is the question we're going to address with our critical thinking hats on, never mind our Sherlock Holmes hats as well. Well, not everybody would agree with the Chabad view. Professor Rachel Hachlili, the late Rachel Hachlili, I regret to say, who was professor of archaeology at the University of Haifa, in her view, the pre-70 AD structures were, quotes, listen to this, didactic learning institutions, as well as assembly and community centres, but not cult or worship places. Well, that's quite something for somebody at the University of Haifa to suggest that the original synagogues were not actually places of worship. Is she right, or is Chabad right? Let's look at the Old Testament and see what we can find there. In the book of Samuel, we read, and this is really quite extraordinary, how a young Joseph lay one night, note, one night, in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and he received several messages from God. Now, according to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, this story, they're interpreting this story from the book of Samuel, shows that incubation was not wholly alien to the Israelites. Now, that's a bit of a bombshell, but I need to explain what we mean by incubation at this point, because I would imagine that this word, apart from when we're incubating eggs, might sound a bit weird. So I'd like you to imagine you're in Greece or Asia Minor in the BC era, and there were hundreds of temples in Greece and Asia Minor dedicated to the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius, and thousands of people would throng to these temples over several centuries, and they would go to seek and obtain health cures. And one of the cures that was offered at these Asclepian centres was known as incubation sleep. And what happened is people would lie down in a building called the Abaton, and they would wake up cured of their ailments. And there are actually inscriptions recording that sometimes people would wake up in a pool of blood, for example, and they would find that the arrowhead had been removed from their body. So what was happening during this incubation sleep, you might ask? Were they administering anesthesia? I rather suspect that they were. No academic will tell you that. Oh no. According to most modern academics, what was happening at Asclepian centres was in the realms of the psychosomatic. We'll come back to Asclepius later. But incubation sleep was real enough at these Asclepian centres. And here's the Theological Dictionary saying that reference in the book of Samuel to Joseph lying one night in the house of the Lord could be a reference to incubation. Very, very important, because that would bring healing within the ambit of the synagogue. And in the same way, the Greek scientist Strabo of Amasia, he's at the turn of the century, if you like, 64 BC up to 24 AD. Listen to what he said. This is really very extraordinary stuff. He writes, Moses advocated that people should set apart a sacred precinct and worship God without an image, and people who have good dreams should sleep in the sanctuary, not only themselves on their own behalf, but also others for the rest of the people. So here we have a second reference to people sleeping in the sanctuary, in other words, the synagogue. And there's even a third reference from John Chrysostom, who was something of an outspoken chap. He was a priest and later patriarch of Constantinople. And he refers to those Christian Judaizers of Antioch who frequented synagogues as holy places for the practice of incubation. He actually uses the word. And so this connects us immediately, unequivocally, with healing in synagogues. So I said I'd say a little bit more about the Asclepian centres in Greece and Asia Minor, which is where the incubation sleep was practiced over many centuries. And you can see there on the left, Pergamon, Asclepian centre in Asia Minor, and on the right, Epidaurus. Both of them had theatres, extraordinarily large theatres. People who went for cures, it was mind and body cures. You know, people would have the physical cures, but they would enjoy the entertainment offered in the theatres. And to give you a sense of the numbers visiting these centres, you only need to look at the capacity of the theatres in these two places. Pergamum had a capacity, wait for it, of 25 to 50,000 people. Extraordinary number. And Epidaurus on the right, well, a much smaller audience, but still enormous, 14,000 capacity at the theatre at Epidaurus. And if you want to compare this with modern day concert halls, well, Sydney Opera has a capacity of just under 6,000, the Royal Albert Hall here in Britain a little over 5,000, and that feels big enough, doesn't it, if you've been in there. And the New York Met, well, under 4,000. So these were astonishingly large places welcoming thousands of people into the centres offering healing cures. I think we can get a sense of the type of cures that they were offering at the Asclepian centres from looking at what we know of the Asclepian family, the alleged 12 children that Asclepius had. And Asclepius was born a mortal, but his cures were considered so miraculous that he was elevated to the Godhead and made into a god. So listen to the names of his children and what they mean. One of them was Padalyrus, which means a skilled diagnostician. Another one was called Macon, which means a master surgeon. Here's another child, Telesphorus. He was the god of vegetation, understanding herbal remedies. So they would have used herbal medicines. And then there was Panacea, we know that word, I think all of us here, the goddess of universal remedy. And Hygeia was another daughter of Asclepius. Speaks for itself, I think. She was concerned with hygiene. And this is thousands of years ahead of Florence Nightingale. Very concerned, even then, with hygiene. And then there was Lasso, the god of recuperation, and Acaso, god of the healing process. Now, if you come away from that, incidentally, do you get the sense that these cures were in the realm of the psychosomatic, which is what modern academics present the Asclepian centres as offering? I don't think so. Very, very skilled they were. But that's a talk for another day if you want to hear more about the Asclepian centres. Let's move on now to the New Testament and see what light this can shed on the synagogue. And as many in the room will know, synagogues feature very, very frequently as places in which teaching and healing take place. So, for example, both Jesus and Paul taught in synagogues, and Jesus actually practiced healing in synagogues. For example, there's the case of the healing of the man with the withered arm, which is spoken about in 3 of the Gospels, in Mark, in Matthew, and also in Luke. So presumably that actually happened, that he healed the man in the synagogue. And according to Matthew, Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. It's a bit ambiguous as to whether those cures are happening in the synagogue, but it could well be the case that that's where the healing was taking place. And what sort of healing are we talking about? Well, John the Baptist asked Jesus if he is the one who is to come. I think he's referring to the Messiah. And Jesus responds, "Go back and tell John what you have seen and heard, namely, that the blind see again, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised to life." So what we have here appears very much to be in the realms of physical healing that we're talking about. And, well, we could dig a little bit deeper. because Matthew mentions no fewer than 20 occasions when Jesus performed healing, either of individuals or of groups of people. And the Greek word that's used in the New Testament is the word therapeon. And that is used to describe the healing in a little over 50% of the cases of healing that Matthew describes. Now, that word therapeon is, if we look it up in a lexicon, is used also by Plato, by Aristotle, and importantly is used in medical treatises by Hippocrates of the famous Hippocratic Oath. And incidentally, Hippocrates was a pupil of Asclepius, and he learnt his art of medicine at Kos, C-O-S. So it does rather appear that the healing described in the New Testament is of a physical nature in at least half of the incidents cited, which is very interesting. What about the disciples? Well, it's been said that at least 7 of the 12 disciples practiced healing. And one of the best examples is Luke, who is referred to in Colossians as the beloved physician. And Eusebius, who is known as the father of church history, he actually described Luke as a physician by profession. Very interesting. And, well, we could go on. When Jesus cured the woman who had a spirit of infirmity, and quotes, was bowed together and could in no wise lift herself up, and that's a quote from Luke, she was then made straight. And Luke, when he describes this miracle, uses the Greek word anorthun, and that is the medical term used to describe the part of the body that returns to its natural position after it's been bent. And so this very much suggests that Jesus was using a medical procedure. And then there's the case of the widow's son, who was restored at Nain, again recounted by Luke, who had a background as a physician. So he would have been very careful about the words he used. And the son is described as sitting up again in bed, and the Greek word used for this is one that, according to a biographer of Luke, Carnac, it's a word that's used in medical texts. And then, well, when Jesus goes into the synagogue in Nazareth, he said unto them, Ye will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. So there seems to be some, if not a lot, of evidence in the New Testament that healing was taking place in synagogues, and that the healing that was being performed was of a physical nature. And if we look at text after the Gospels, then we find this impression, occurring again. So the Acts of Pilate, you may or may not have heard of that one, that was written shortly after Jesus' death by Nicodemus in Hebrew. And the chief priests are quoted as saying, we have a law that we should not heal anyone on the Sabbath. But this man, with his evil deeds, has healed on the Sabbath. He's healed the lame, the bent, the withered, the blind, the paralytic, and the possessed. And Pilate asks in this account, Acts of Pilate, with what evil deeds? And the answer that comes back is, he is a sorcerer, they're referring to Jesus here, and by Beelzebub, he is the prince of the devil. He casts out evil spirits, and all are subject to him. And what then Pilate says is astonishing. Pilate then says, he disagrees with that interpretation. He says, no, this is not to cast out demons by unclean spirits, but by the god Asclepius. Could some of the healing that was happening have been informed by Asclepian type medical practice? Well, we can't go into that today. That would, again, be for another day. But here's another apocryphal text, the Acts of John, written in the 3rd century. And in a section there, when a lady, Cleopatra, not Antony's Cleopatra, when she is healed, she appeals to Jesus in this way, saying, "O Christ, now is the time for us who are sick to help from thee, O physician." And in a later section we find this prayer, "Jesus, thou only protector of thy servants and physician who healest for naught, do thou assist thy servants by their visitation." So we've looked at synagogues in the Old Testament, we've looked at synagogues in the New Testament. There seems to be evidence that from the Old Testament people were sleeping in the synagogues, and from the New Testament evidence that real physical healing was happening there. What about archaeological evidence? Well, this is equally exciting, if not more exciting. Here you see an image of the first ever inscription in a synagogue, and it reads as follows. This is the translation, obviously. "Theodotus, son of Vetanus, priest and head of the synagogue, son of a head of the synagogue, and grandson," is obviously in the family of a head of the synagogue, "built the synagogue," listen to this, "for the reading of the law and for the teaching of the commandments, as well as the guest room, the chambers, and the water fittings, as an inn for those people who are needy from abroad." What is absent from this description? What are they not saying is happening at this synagogue? Prayer. No reference to prayer. Do you remember we talked about Professor Rachel Haklili, who said she didn't think that synagogues were places of prayer? And here's the first ever inscription that makes no reference to prayer, but does talk about the synagogue being frequented by the needy, and there are places for them to stay. Very fascinating. Here are images of two of the earliest ever recorded synagogues. And the one on the left is Gamla, and the one on the right is at Masada. Some of you may have been to Masada by the Dead Sea. It's where a group of Jews committed suicides rather than be killed by the Romans. And, well, I don't know, you may not be able to see them that clearly, especially people at the back. So let me describe them very briefly. These structures consist, well, this is how archaeologists describe them, as having parallel rows of seats. Not rows, but concentric would be for a round shape. I don't know what the word is where the shape is rectangular. But you've got a series of what are described as benches that people sat at while they were attending the session in the synagogue. And can you see a couple of columns in the middle? So there would have been columns down the middle of this structure, which has led an academic, Strange, in 2001, to say that if you were sitting there in the congregation, sitting on the benches, it would have been an auditory experience only and not a visual one, because the columns down the middle would have blocked your view. Strangely, these buildings, and the Masada building has the same system of parallel, what they call benches, they could have only accommodated 200 people, which wouldn't have made for a very big congregation. Now take a look at this pool of Siloam that flows into the temple in Jerusalem. Do you notice the system of benches surrounding the pool? It's a system of, well, very similar, seems to me, to those two synagogues that we've just looked at. But clearly, the function that they're fulfilling here is not one of benches, is it? What's the function of these layers of stone? steps into the pool. Yes. So maybe these first synagogues were not places where people would sit and listen, but maybe they were swimming pools. And in talking about a swimming pool, we have to move away from the modern day notion of a swimming pool and think more about the value that was placed on water as an instrument of healing in ancient times. And in fact, the pool of Siloam that I showed you is thought to have been mineral rich. The water that flowed into that pool was mineral rich. How exciting is that? Going back to the Asclepian centres, at the Corinthian Asclepian centre, there were 6 thermal springs, all slightly radioactive, with a very high mineral content. At Epidaurus, and you saw the theatre at Epidaurus, there were 2 springs that flowed into that centre, and they both had the same mineral content as the alkaline spring waters at Evian in France, and so would have been very effective with liver, urinary or digestive organs. And then Kos, do you remember, that was the place that Hippocrates trained at. All the water troughs there are fed by iron and sulphur springs, and so on and so on. We could go on at length. Here's an image of one of the baths. This particular image is one of the baths at Pergamon, which was do you remember the first site I showed you with the enormous capacity in its theatre? And all the Asclepian centres worked with water. People would have a bath before they saw the priest. Maybe that was for cleansing purposes. The Abaton, do you remember that was the place where the special incubation sleep happened? There were baths at Epidaurus next to the Abaton. And it just goes on. The water is a very important part of the healing process at these Asclepian centres. And if we move over and forward in time to Qumran by the Dead Sea, that's the site next to which they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves that were adjoining Qumran. And, well, it's an extraordinary site because it largely consists of nothing but 12 baths. It's got the highest concentration of baths anywhere in Israel. And, of course, there are big cisterns that feed those baths. Now, the official narrative, if you like, about Qumran says that, they needed all these baths because it was hot and they needed drinking water. And they said that the baths were used for ritual immersion. But the capacity of the water at the site is surplus to the requirements of the small community that Dead Sea Scrolls historians allege lived there. And scholars who say that these people washed a lot, I don't think it really fits the evidence, quite frankly. Most scholars, I make a space for myself because I've written some articles on this site, ignore some really critical facts, namely that Greeks and Jews used baths for hydrotherapy. And in fact, an author, Preus, Preus, writing in 2004 about medicine in ancient times, this is what he wrote. He said, the bath in biblical times was most importantly a means for the maintenance of health. There we have it. And I've written articles in which I've argued that Qumran, far from being just a home for reclusive and pious Essenes, was actually being run as an extraordinarily successful health centre, providing cures based on wonderful herbal medicines, frankincense, myrrh, balsam. And I just give you one little bit of evidence. You can find more in the articles at the back of the room if you're intrigued by all of this. It's alleged that this was home to a very small group of pious Jews, the Essenes, and yet there are no fewer than 4 cemeteries around the site. Why would you need so many cemeteries for a small community? Of course, it makes sense if you imagine it was a health centre with thousands of people flocking there for cures. And there's a piece of evidence that really nudges us very strongly, I think, in that direction. And that is the fact that in 70% of the corpses that they unearthed from Qumran, in 70% of the corpses, there were traces of madder dye. That's dye from the madder plant, Rubia tinctorum, to give it its Latin name. Now, there is an article in Nature discussing this. Nature, we're told, is one of the leading science journals of the world. This was written in the 1970s. It argues, well, it concludes that the madder was used for ritual-magical purposes. That's their bottom line conclusion. But if we put our critical thinking hats on and we question everything, what's one of the first questions we're going to ask about madder? To find out why it was in 70% of the corpses. And incidentally, madder is a very fast dye. It couldn't have leached from people's clothing. It must have been drunk. Why were people drinking madder dye? Well, what the article in Nature failed to look at, and question that may be in all of your minds, is what are the chemical constituents of madder? Were you asking yourself that question, perhaps? Well, it's actually a member of the quinine family. Isn't that interesting? And we know that quinine is effective against malaria and a host of other illnesses. So I rather suggest that rather than being used purely for ritual-magical purposes, as the article in Nature would have us believe, that it was actually being used to help cure people of a number of diseases. And those who were buried, unfortunately, the cures hadn't worked. And in fact, although Josephus, who's a very reliable source at that time, described the Essenes as living to a remarkable old age, many surpassing the age of 100, 85% of the bodies buried in the cemetery were aged less than 40. So I don't think these were the bodies of the regular community. I think they were the bodies of people visiting the site. And the takeaway for us today is that water and baths played a very big part. So if we go back to the pool of Siloam, remember that was the one whose waters flowed from the temple in Jerusalem. The waters there are mineral rich, high concentrations of potassium, magnesium and boron. So maybe that was used for healing. And maybe the original synagogues looked like the pool of Siloam. Here's the final image I'm going to show you of a synagogue. This is the largest ever found in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, a place called Sardis, dates to the 3rd century AD. And, well, scholars have no doubt this was a synagogue used for prayer. Well, let me tell you a little bit about this building. It occupied a corner of a Bath gymnasium complex. What do you think of that? And I was reading through an article on the inscriptions found in this building, the synagogue. And one of these inscriptions really caught my eye because it was made on account of the donor's good health. Why would you have an inscription that registered the donor's good health, unless perhaps the donor had been suffering from ill health before he went to this synagogue? And people, we're told, would contribute bays in the building there, and the building is very long and narrow and divided up with bays. So could these bays have been the sort of bays that you might find in a ward, I ask you? that's really what I want to say about the history of synagogues. I think it's difficult for us to say conclusively that these buildings were not in some way involved in the business of health. But maybe at the question at the end, you could tell me what you think about that. Let's move on now to cathedrals and churches, which come later, of course, in history. And you have an image here, I hope you can see it, of the oldest cathedral in the world in Armenia. And this is called the Echmiadzin Cathedral, which we're told was built in its current form in the 5th century AD, 483 AD. And what a magnificent building this is. Can you see the dome? Can you see the extraordinary shapes which bear a resemblance to cymatic shapes? We'll come on to cymatic shapes in a little bit. So hang on in there, even if you don't know that name. Chartres. How many people have visited Chartres Cathedral in France? One. Please, it's a wonderful building. Go if you haven't been there. Extraordinary building. Now, on the floor in Chartres Cathedral is this labyrinth. It's etched out of the stone, and it produces electromagnetic radiation, which is tuned to 7.83 hertz. And that frequency is not only Earth's frequency when struck by lightning, but is also the frequency of our brains. And, well, when I've read commentators, and there are not many, unfortunately, who write about this, they've said that if our bodies can be brought in sync with Earth's frequencies, and that's the Schumann resonance, then if we're in sync, then we're less likely to suffer from illnesses such as insomnia or immune suppression. And we're more likely to heal, and we're more likely to experience increased vitality. So is this labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral a giant Schumann resonance machine, if you like, that was created in order to restore health? And of course that would be just the beginning of where we go with this subject of health in churches and cathedrals. Let's move on now. Cymatics. I must say a few words about cymatics before going more in depth into this topic. How many people have heard of cymatics? Oh, a lot. Well, no surprises there. Somebody called Ernst Chladni, I don't know quite how you pronounce his word, he wrote a book in the 18th century, Discoveries on the Theory of Sound. And he describes how sound can be made visible by putting sound through sand particles. That's what he did. And he showed extraordinary cymatic patterns, intricate patterns. He showed how if the sound was put through the sand, you could see these extraordinary patterns. And later researchers, instead of using sand, have used water. So what I'm going to show you now is some of these cymatic images made from water. And they'll be on the right-hand side of the image I'm about to show you. And on the left-hand side, for comparison, are some of the rose windows that appear in churches and cathedrals. So on the right, you've got the cymatic patterns from sound being reflected in water. And on the left, you have the shapes that we've seen so often when going into churches and cathedrals. And do you see a similarity between the two? Yes, they're virtually parallel, identical. And some people say that the shapes of the rose windows are mirrored on the cymatic patterns produced within the church or cathedral. Some people also think that there may not have been glass originally in those shapes in the churches and cathedrals, and that the shapes may themselves have transformed the sounds within the church or the cathedral. It really is extraordinary, and I'll tell you a bit more about the studies in a minute. But while we're on these shapes, we've all heard about how Rockefeller moved the tuning of musical instruments from 432 hertz to 440 hertz. And I thought you might like to see what those two look like in cymatic form. On the left is the old 432 hertz. And what a beautiful shape that is. Would you agree? And on the right, how can we describe that? Any words come to mind?
Chaotic.
Distortion.
Distortion? Any other words? Devoid of shape, devoid of beauty. And that's what we have now, musical instruments tuned to 440 hertz, not producing the beautiful cymatic shapes of the musical instruments of the past. Of course, we don't have to accept this, do we? We don't have to accept anything. So we have the opportunity now to retune our instruments, do we not? Just put the clock back. And I'm sure this group would be amongst the first to do that, knowing how knowledgeable you are. So just a brief word about some of the studies that have been carried out. This is quite an extraordinary one by Tanya Harris, fairly recently in 2013. She went into 4 churches, which ostensibly were designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor. I say ostensibly because we do have to question, really, who was behind the architecture of these magnificent buildings. That's something we'll pick up on in a bit. And magnificent not just in terms of their visual appearance, but also in terms of what she found out about these buildings. Because what she did was take in a recording machine, and then she recorded the apparent silence that was in these 4 churches. And she recorded for about 7 minutes duration. Then, in a second stage of the study, she played the recordings back while recording the sound again, so that she would gain an amplified recording of whatever sound was in the church. And then she created her own cymatic device, and she played the recording through the water to observe what, if anything, was there. And let me just remind you, to all intents and purposes, she was recording silence. There was no sound, audible sound in the church. But when she put the sound through the water, in one of the churches, a 5-pointed star appeared, which was in proportion to the golden ratio. So, apparent silence, but not silence. A beautiful frequency was being emitted, which is one of the reasons I think later on we need to think carefully about who the creators of these extraordinary buildings actually were, who could create a building that could create a sound that could be mapped into a beautiful shape. Here's a second study. I mean, there are many others, but I thought these 2 were particularly interesting. This was done by 2 researchers, Professor Sungjul Ji, who is retired now, but he was at Rutgers University in America, and he did most of his research with a cymatic expert, John Stuart Reid. And this piece of research was carried out in 2018 to 2020. And this time, they used sound and they exposed red blood cells to sound for 20 minutes. And so for 20 minutes they played music and they observed the effect of the music on the blood cells. And this is what they found. Extraordinary stuff. That blood samples exposed to music in the frequency range of 70 to 85 decibels, and 85 is about the limit of what any human really wants to hear, produced a higher number of viable red blood cells than samples exposed to silence. So in other words, blood cells become more viable when exposed to music. And lower frequencies, including music with a throbbing bass, provide more oxygen to hemoglobin molecules than do higher frequencies. So in other words, there are benefits to both higher and also lower frequencies in music. And this is very, very, very significant, given that 60% or so of the human body is actually made up of water. And so the cymatic shapes that we see recorded in water will presumably appear in our own water systems, not only in the blood systems. And so we're finding that music has a health-giving effect, not just on blood, but also on water. And these two researchers found that hearing low frequencies will boost the oxygen in the blood hemoglobin and boost immune response. Well, that's very, very interesting, because what sort of music was played traditionally in churches and cathedrals? Well, any thoughts? What sort of music? We've got choral music on the one hand, and organ music on the other. So let's take a look at these two for a moment. The architecture of churches and cathedrals. Many people have commented, I'll come back to this slide in a second, that many churches and cathedrals have extraordinary floors. This is a floor from St. Peter's, Rome. And yet today, if you wander into a church or cathedral, they're very often completely covered over, aren't they, with pews. So some people say, actually, these pews were probably not an original part of church or cathedral architecture, because why would you put chairs on beautiful mosaic floors like the one here from St. Peter's, Rome? On the other hand, people point out that the choir stalls towards the back of the church or the cathedral are often very intricate and seem to be an integral part of the building, suggesting therefore that choral music was created to be heard in church. I think the logic is very persuasive, personally. And what we find with choral music is very often written in SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. So we have both the high frequencies that we talked about, as well as the low frequencies. And so people attending the churches or cathedrals would have had both the benefits of the low and the high frequencies when they were listening to choral music. And very interesting, a few years ago in Oregon, the artist Shelley Sokolovsky, working with John Stuart Reid, who's the cymatic expert that I referred to, they projected music into a pool of water that measured 6 feet in diameter. And I thought you might like to see a clip or some clips from this film, because what you're going to do is hear the music and see the cymatic shapes produced by the music. Let's hope that that this works. We're going to begin with the sound of a bell. We'll come to bells in a minute. most churches in the past always had extraordinary range of bells. We'll look at the sounds of bells, then we'll look at the sounds of a choir, and then we'll hear the sound of an organ playing Bach's Toccata in D minor. Here's hoping it works. That's the bell, and the shape in the water of the bell. SATB choir. And now for some fireworks with the organ. So, what do you think of that? Extraordinary, no? And, well, while we're talking about choral music, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, while we're talking about choral music, was the music written for Christian services, or were the words added later? Now, these are just my own personal thoughts, but I'd like to know what you think. One of my personal favourite pieces of music is Bach's B minor Mass, and I suppose I'm particularly. How many people have heard Bach's B minor Mass? A few. If you haven't heard it, I would say go listen to it. But when I was at school, and wasn't a fantasy school, it was a girls' grammar school, we had a director of music who was very ambitious, and the school had a centenary in Westminster Abbey, and he said we should be singing the Bach B minor Mass. So I know it a little bit, just because I was singing alto, I think, in those days, in Westminster Abbey. And I was listening again recently to the music, and we haven't got a lot of time to hear a lot, but I'm just going to play you 3 snippets. First of all, the opening Kyrie, and the words are Kyrie eleison. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it from the back, but you've got the words and the music. And what we have is an extraordinary use of elisma, which is using one syllable, say, for an enormous number of notes. And I just want to put the question to you, do you think that this music would originally have been set to the words in the way that Bach, we're told, set the words? So here, have a listen to the Kyrie. So listen to that in your own time, the opening Kyrie, after the orchestral opening there. Now, I want you to hear the Gloria, not because it's my name, but because really interesting the way these words relate to the music. Here it is. So much of the singing is on a single syllable. Oh, did you catch that? If you were writing from scratch, my question is this: would you use those words and have people sing in that way? And the voices go tremendously high. Here's the last one, Sanctus, which has the same feature again. It's also very beautiful. There you go. Did you hear how a lot of the music was around another syllable? This one was the A in Sanctus. The singers are being required to do really verbal acrobatics on that single syllable of A. So, oh, is it going to come again? Stop it. It's got a life of its own here. Just want to go on to the next song. Next song.
They're all
Next,
going.
yeah.
Just try and say something. There we go. Well done.
Yep. Ah, well. So, we'll come back to Bach in a little bit, but the organ, we saw the extraordinary fireworks of somatics produced by Bach's Toccata in D minor. And one of the earliest organs, I believe, was in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, 1403. It was a 5-keyboard manual with 8,000 pipes. Now, that sounds like a big deal, doesn't it? Until you go to this church, which is in Germany. It's the largest organ of all time in Europe, I believe, with over 17,000 pipes. Extraordinary. That's St. Stephen's Cathedral in Passau in Germany. And the extremely long pipes of the oldest organs produce overtones, harmonies, and fine, low, healing frequencies. And the cathedrals and the churches that were homes to these magnificent instruments seem to have been built to magnify the healing frequencies. Absolutely extraordinary. I just want to finish this part of the talk by talking a little bit about bells, because they were a much bigger feature in the past than they are now. And bells vibrate at the ultrasound frequency, and that serves to increase people's immune systems and make it easier to recover from infectious diseases. And I've read that the unique spiral part of the sound wave from the bell destroys cell structures of microorganisms, including hepatitis, typhus, influenza, cholera, anthrax, all within seconds. And all of that is according to a researcher in Russia, where they had a lot of bells, whose name is Shipunova, and she was an academician of the Institute of Biosphere of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And the frequency of bells can also reduce pain, reduce the hydrodynamic resistance of blood vessels, and all of that can result in increased blood and lymph flow. Extraordinary. And the sound can also excite microleptons, and that can help defeat isotopes that are harmful to health, providing a healing and rejuvenating effect on the human body. And during many centuries, I read, over many centuries, during epidemics, sometimes the bells would sound all day in order to ensure healing of the populations who were living in the vicinity of the bells. Apparently low bell tones affect a person more favourably than do high bell tones. But as we saw earlier, both high and low frequencies can have beneficial effects on health. They can also operate at a psychological level. They can relieve stress. I suppose unless you're living bang next door to to a church that's sounding out its bells day and night. And they can help with anxiety and sleep disorders. Water. I thought I should probably say something about water, because we talked about water in relation to the synagogue. And the relic of the importance of water, of course, is in the baptismal font. But if we go to somewhere like Lourdes, of course, that is a celebration of the healing power, is it not, of water. So we've been looking at synagogues, churches and cathedrals and whether they had healing functions rather than just functions as places of worship. And, well, I don't know about you, but I think the evidence is pretty strong, really, between the synagogues, churches and cathedrals. And maybe they were doing more than healing, not just healing. And I say that in the light of images such as this, which many of you, I guess, particularly in this group, will be aware of, that the jaggedy edges on the spires of the church, do they not resemble transformers? And there is a view that these magnificent buildings, which reached out into the sky and into the ether, were also drawing in energy from the ether, literally bringing in energy. And maybe that had an additive effect on the healing produced by the organ and by the choirs in those buildings. And the architraves also, it's thought, had an effect. Somebody labelled this archivolts, that shape is also having a conductive effect on electricity. So, yes, I think that worship, given what we said about pews sitting on beautiful marble floors, may have been something of a side issue originally in these places. We can have a vote maybe at the end and see what you think. But I did talk about Bach, and maybe this is a chance just to do what Einstein asks us to do, question everything. Shall we just have a quick look at Bach's biography? I don't know what you think about it, but I thought, this is an interesting one. He wrote 1,500 works of music. He composed new works on paper at night using a quill pen after everyone had gone to bed. He had a day job, as you know, as an organist. So he did his writing at night by candlelight. For 50 years, not a single piece that he'd written was published. You may know he was virtually forgotten at his death, and the bulk of his work lay neglected for almost 100 years. And it was only thanks to Mendelssohn, we're told, in the 19th century, that we actually know of Bach today, because Mendelssohn, himself another extraordinary character, we could go through his biography as well. He revived, we're told, the Matthew Passion, but until that point, fish vendors, this is the story you'll read in books, fish vendors in the market were wrapping their wares in Bach's manuscripts. How could that be, such fabulous music, that it was neglected and used to wrap fish? Well, and also, just logistically, if you look at it, 1,500 pieces of music. He died at 65, he must have started at 20. That would be a new piece of music every 21 days. Is this possible? And then, well, let's take the case of Schubert. He died, well, his lifespan was half that of Bach. He died at the tender age of 31. He was a school teacher, busy in the day, and he left behind him, we are told, 1,500 pieces of music, of which 600 were for the piano, nearly 600 were songs, lieder, and each one a masterpiece, and very complex. 150 part songs, 40 liturgical compositions, including masses, big works, 20 string quartets, quintets, including, for example, the Trout Quintet, and trios and duos, and 20 stage works, including operas, and 7 completed symphonies, all by the age of 31. Is this possible? And so I think, on that note, we should segue into asking, who was behind the magnificent buildings and the magnificent music. Some people talk Tartaria, so I thought we could spend the rest of our time today here in Holt asking ourselves, what do we know about Tartaria? Is it conceivable that an old world order, if you like, an older civilization hidden from our history books, is responsible for the magnificent churches, cathedrals, and some of the music that was performed in the churches and cathedrals? What do we know? Let's begin with some facts about Tartaria. Here's a map from 1570 by Abraham Ortelius, and you can see a section with a red oval around it. That's saying Tartaria there. The next reference I found a very exciting one, 1704. This is a book, A System of Geography, or A New and Accurate Description of the Earth in All Its Empires, Kingdoms and States. That's the title of the book, which allegedly was published in London. Here's those words on the original cover. And this is what extraordinarily you find inside. It's probably difficult to read. I'll just read out the first bit. The country of Tartary, called Great Tartary, to distinguish it from the lesser in Europe, has its boundaries on the west of the Caspian Sea, and it goes on to talk about the boundaries. I really just wanted to draw your attention today to this distinction between Greater Tartary, which covers a lot of the current day Russian landmass, and the distinction with Lesser Tartary, which he describes as being in Europe. Then the Encyclopedia Britannica, no less, at the end of the 18th century, 1771, it has this entry on Tartaria. Tartaria, a huge country in the northern part of Asia, bordering Siberia, in the north and west, called the Great Tartary. So there it was in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it went on to say, Tartars living south of Muscovy and Siberia are called Astrakhan, Cherkasy and Dagestan. Living in the northwest of the Caspian Sea, they're called Kalmyk Tatar. And it goes on to repeat the other book in terms of where they're based, between Siberia and the Caspian Sea. And there are also Tibetan living to the northwest from China. And here's another map showing the landmass of Tartary in relation to China on the bottom right of this map. And you can see Eastern Tartary and Western Tartary indicated on that map. Now, interesting, isn't it, to find so much documentary evidence? And we even read of a classified CIA document dating to 1957. Many of you will have read about this, I'm sure, that was revealed in 1998, that stated that religion, language, and history constitute a nation's cultural heritage. Let me just say that again. Religion, language, and history creates a nation's cultural heritage. And that in 1944, the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party issued a directive that, quote, there should be a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria. And that's allegedly in a CIA document talking about the cover-up of Tartaria, notwithstanding the fact that they had their own flag with an owl, as you can see there. And we've even got images handed down through history of the people who populated these parts of the world. Very tall people, averaging some 8 to 12 feet in height. Maybe that would explain the very tall doorways that you find in churches and cathedrals. What do other, more modern contemporary commentators say. Well, many of you, I'm sure, will have heard Max Egan, and this is what he has to say about the Tartarians. He says that Tartaria extended across Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines, and that it was destroyed in the mid 1880s. He's referring to the mud floods that occurred in the 19th century, a succession of 3 mud floods. And he focused particularly on the children. Many people have suggested that during the 19th century, the children would have been separated from the adults. And some of you may have seen photographs of orphan trains. That's trains just full of children. And Max Egan said that between 1860 and 1880, about 200,000 children per year were shipped from the east, Russia part of the world, to the west across America. And I mean, this is extraordinary if it's true. So many children shipped from east to west. He suggests that in just 1 year alone, it could have been as many as 435,000 children. And they were separated from the adults on the basis that they could be re-educated into the way of thinking of the industrial West in a way that perhaps the adults couldn't. And other commentators suggest that the adults, because they were not so amenable to being re-educated, were housed in mental asylums which sprung up all over the world. Max Egan says that 100,000 children were shipped to Australia, New Zealand and South Africa each year, and he talks about the foundling homes. 1,200, he said, in Florence alone, and 45,000 children in one home. Well, he doesn't give his sources, but I'm just offering that to you today. And another commentator, Campbell, some of you may have come across him, he talks about Tartaria as extending as far as Europe and America. And he talks about the fact that the cities weren't founded in America, they were found because they were already there, they say. And his view is that the world fairs, whether it was in London, well, they were world fairs worldwide, or whether they were in America, Campbell thinks that these were the work of this Tartarian civilization and that they were reattributed to the people of their times. Here's an image of the Chicago World Fair, 1893, in all of its magnificence. Is that the work of Tartarians or contemporary people in America in 1893? Well, there's a very good book on Tartaria, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of the author, but he says that the photographs that show scaffolding never actually show people working with the scaffolding. And this author suggests that maybe this is just to persuade people into thinking that this magnificent type of building could actually be the work of people in 1893. And Campbell also talks about the anomaly of Australia, which officially was discovered by Captain Cook in 1770, officially colonised in 1778, yet pictures of Sydney in just 4 decades later show it with magnificent buildings. Again, were they found or founded? And Campbell thinks that they were already there. Here's a book that's very interesting to dip into. It's freely available online by James Lee. It's called The One World Tartarians. Written 2020. It's got a mass of photographic evidence, both of buildings, of transport systems, and churches and cathedrals, the subject of today. And this is what Lee says, and we're coming to the end of the talk at this point. The people of Tartary were destroyed by the same advanced technology that controls our weather. They were flooded, firebombed, earthquaked, and likely had directed energy weapons used against them. And many of their bones are buried under our cities today. And Lee, very interestingly, I think, suggests that many of the disasters through history were attempts, and quite successful attempts, to destroy this old world civilization. Some people refer to it as the old world order. And so I've taken this information from Lee here, the Black Death in the 14th century, which in a separate presentation I've given, I suggest was not the result of bubonic plague. No, rather the result of something that suggests that the hand of man was involved. I can talk about that another time if you'd like. But the Black Death succeeded in killing between 25 and 50 million people across Europe. The Mediterranean, Scandinavia, Britain, Eastern Europe, all were affected by the Black Death. And then he talks about the Spanish takeover of South America in the 16th and 17th centuries. He suggests that close to 35 million casualties arose from that. The French wars of religion in the 16th century, 3 million. Stalin-Lenin's actions, 40 million between 1910 and 1950. World War I he includes as a further attempt to eradicate the old world order, 8.5 million. And the Spanish flu vaccine, 1918, he has the casualties from that as 30 to 50 million. Well, that's Lee's view. Many floods, many disasters, and many people talk of Tartaria as a benevolent society where sacred geometry was used, pipe organs, bells, all used to assist in people's healing and to achieve a higher level of consciousness. And, well, it's tragic, beyond tragic, if what Lee is saying is correct. The cover-up of this history and the continual destruction. In Lee's book, you can find this map, which shows the number of churches that have been destroyed in France over the period, I think, of 2016 to 2020. And we know about Notre Dame in Paris, that was affected by fire. And the damage is on a much larger scale even than that. So this is the last of the slides of the presentation. Could it be that synagogues, churches and cathedrals were originally places of magnificence and places of healing, more than places of worship? And could it also be that they were created by an old world order that has been systematically destroyed, but is still alive in spirit? Could it be? Lots of questions to answer. And I hope we have time for a few questions. I would just like to say that it is in our hands to restore a wonderful past. Would you agree?
Yes.
We don't have to accept the destruction of an old world order. And this diagram shows that perhaps many of you think we live in a world which is characterized by deceit rather than truth, that this has led us into a state of crisis which has produced fake agendas, assaults on our freedom, assaults on our food, and our very ability to go on living. But there are, of course, solutions, and the good news is that those solutions are in your hands. There is no knight coming to save people, I don't think. It's in our hands. And one of the things I'm particularly focused on is the state of education today, whether in schools, what they're teaching in history, just to name one thing, or in universities. And if you're interested in helping to create a better school and university system, please do talk to me before I go today, or email me. We've set up Truth University, the home of critical thinking, where we do the kind of thinking that we've done today. And you can do a research qualification, you can write your own research, you can write a short piece of research or a longer piece of research, and if it's of a high quality, Truth University Press will publish that research. And at school level, well, with so much false information, we do need to create, I think, new school textbooks and possibly a new school exam with it. So if you have skills in that area, again, please do speak to me or email the email you can see there, info@truthuniversity@protonmail.com, info@truthuniversity@protonmail.com. And just a quick heads up, Christabel and I, if you're interested in this Tartaria thing, we'll be donning our Sherlock Holmes hats and all the critical thinking we can muster to look at stately homes in Wiltshire and ask who was really behind the history of these stately homes. And this summer I'm organising a conference questioning science and the media. That's up in the beautiful Peak District. There's some flyers on the table at the back if you're interested. Mark Devlin's the speaker, and also Stephen Denman, who is fascinating about Tartaria and many other subjects. And Martin Colburn will be asking, is there a glass ceiling in science? Interesting question. A couple of books available at the back, published by Truth University Press. I think I've referred to this one already. The Dark Side of Academia, How Truth is Suppressed. Virtually none of what we've presented today would appear in a university context. It's all new information. And exciting, isn't it, to have new information? And the tools for this new information, as I said, is critical thinking and questioning absolutely everything that comes our way. I don't like to blow my own trumpet in any way. I wrote that book with Catherine Armitage. But here are a couple of reviews that appeared. Jane said, I've read your book and I found it to be the most thought-provoking and interesting book I have ever read. And that may be because in the middle of the book are 24 first-person accounts of people with their critical thinking journeys from childhood to adulthood. And in the course of presenting their journeys, my goodness, the information they share with us is extraordinary, whether it's about history or about the legal system or about the police system. And many of the authors are people you'll know, like Mark Devlin, John Hamer, and many others. And Nigel said it was a lucky day when I found out about your book. So that's what I wanted to say to you today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope we do have some time for questionings and your thoughts about churches, cathedrals, and synagogues. Do you think they may have been places of healing primarily? Thank you. And I suppose if that's correct, with the glorious choral music and organ music that we had, what can we do to go back to that? I mean, do we have to sit in rows and be told what to do by somebody at the front, a priest or a rabbi? Or could we organise it in some other way? I don't know. What do you think?
Playing music in the old tuning inside of the cathedral seems to be important. Playing music in the old tuning seems to be important in these
put
places.
Music back to the
Because the bells have all been swapped out.
That would be a very good start, wouldn't it? Go back to that.
The bells throughout Europe were taken out in the beginning of the 20th century from just about every church and cathedral. And no doubt that was to swap them to a different tuning so they're no longer
So
resonant.
the gentleman in the front saying the bells were taken out from churches.
Supposedly to make weapons for the
To-
wars.
well, when were they taken out?
When?
When?
Early 20th century.
In the early 20th century.
There's
Then you
pictures.
went back into
There's
the
pictures
churches.
of them all and it was supposedly for the war efforts.
Make tanks.
But when they're put back in, they won't be the original tuning, and so they're no longer resonant with the building.
So the bells came back after the war.
Yeah, so I've seen pictures. I'm sure you can find them. That part of the war efforts, supposedly in the early 20th century, that there was thousands of bells removed from all the towers in the cathedrals and the churches. And one of the functions of that would be that the bells of the original frequencies would no longer be in there. So when they were replaced, they would no longer be tuned to the same frequency as the cathedral was designed to resonate in. So now we get much less of a strong effect through the building, if any effect at all. It'll coincide at some frequencies, but really they should be a different frequency. And probably with the amount of organ restoration that's gone on, I bet the same thing's happened to the organ pipes as well. So I think the cymatics was lovely there, but there was a lot of blobby going on. And I'm sure if the 17,000 pipes of Passau Cathedral were in their original tuning, I bet you'll have a job staying on the floor in there.
So what can we do?
Well, I think the only thing we can do in a practical sense is we can't use the bells and the organs, but we can use voices, tuned instruments, anything where we can use the original frequencies inside of the resonant buildings seems to be the way. Well, I know there are ensembles that play in 432, so maybe that's a possibility. Or get a campaign to get the bells changed.
All right, just one more question and then we're taking a break. It's 9 o'clock.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention, I love your talk, and it's opened my mind to certain things I hadn't thought about before with churches. I'm a geomancer, so I work with the earth energies in places. And I think you're right, the churches to me were devices and temples, and they're mixing, as you say, the geometry of the place with the earth energies underneath, and the sound and the ritual. And when we go into that space, it is, if it's all clean, if it's all set up properly, it is profoundly healing just walking in there. And sometimes I go to church, not that I'm a churchy person, but I like to watch the energies while the services are going on and how it activates the different, the energy anatomy of a church and the people. And, you know, I'll often see the colours and feel things that are going on. And I think, you know, the whole thing, and the link to the cosmos as well, like I said, with Tartaria, the structures, they're working with the cosmic energy, the earth energy, the geometry, the sound. I'm getting tingles now. And when you walk into that, if it's all set up right, and then, you know, it's an amazingly profound experience. It's our soul connection as well as our health, our immune system and everything. And back in that time, it must have been stunning when these were operating fully. My God, to walk into that must have been an incredibly beautiful experience, I think. And hopefully, as you say, we can bring it back now in a new form. It won't go back exactly that, but yeah. Oh, that's a whole other.
That
I just got goosebumps then.
So it heals the soul and
Yes.
and the physical body.
Yeah.
And for those who didn't hear, maybe we can bring it back in a different form. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a break. We'll come back at 4:15. We've got Annie talking about.
Now that we've looked in general terms at the way that synagogues, cathedrals and churches may have served as places of healing rather than simply places of worship, we're just going to pick up on some themes and dig down a bit deeper, beginning with where the country of Tartaria may actually have extended to. And in looking at this question, I'm just going to pick up on something that one of the commentators that we saw earlier talking about Tartaria, the way that one of these commentators, Campbell, has described the possible presence of a Tartarian civilization on the southeastern coast of America. What he actually said on a recording was that Tartaria extended as far not just as Europe, but also as America, and included a place he referred to as Norumbega. Well, that's interesting. What we learn is that back in the 16th century, David Ingram, who was an English sailor, in November of 1567, found himself marooned with some 100 of his shipmates on the coast of Mexico, and he was about 200 miles south of Texas and the Mexican border at that point. Now, David Ingram, along with 24 of his party, travelled north into the interior of America in order to avoid capture. And 11 months later, he and 2 others of his original party were picked up from the coast of Nova Scotia. That's a long way away from Mexico, and they were picked up by a French fishing vessel. Okay, so much for David Ingram's travels. What's really interesting to us is to see how he described the city of Norumbega. It was the stuff of, you might have said, fantasy, because he wrote that he saw kings decorated with rubies that were 6 inches in length. And he said that these kings were carried on chairs of silver and crystal, which in turn were adorned with precious stones. He described pearls being as common as pebbles in the streets, and that the natives of Norumbega were laden down with ornaments of silver and gold. He said that the streets were wider than those in London. That's a rather lovely description, taking London as the great metropolis that he knew of. And he said that some houses had massive pillars of crystal and of silver. And last, but by no means least, he described the people living there as fair and tall. And this is extremely interesting, all of this. But the last point about the height of the people living in Norumbega is perhaps particularly interesting, because separate accounts, and we have photographic evidence as well, show the Tartarians as very tall people, averaging some 8 to 12 feet in height, towering over modern-day humans. And this could well explain the immense height of some of the doorways into churches and cathedrals, and the doorways into stately homes as well. So you can see an image in the slide of one of these Tartarian giants, and here are a couple of maps so that you can see where Norumbega is situated in modern-day America. It's to the north of the Bermuda Triangle, and it's north of Florida as well. And the second map shows you the Bermuda Triangle, this enigmatic place in which many seafaring people lose their lives. And you can see one of the apexes of the Bermuda Triangle takes you to Florida, and Norumbega would have taken you up that coast. Very roughly would have taken you, well, as I say, opposite the Bermuda Triangle, perhaps where South Carolina is shown on this modern-day map. And it wasn't just the height of the Tartarians that caused astonishment, but also the extraordinary manner in which they harnessed free energy from the ether. And they were ingenious people because they did this through a number of means. They used domes, typically on the top of cathedrals, towers, minarets, bridges even, obelisks, and last but by no means least, star fortress complexes. And if you haven't come across star forts as they're described, then here is a slide showing 4, because they appear right across the world. And even on this single slide, you can see star forts from Canada, as well as from Europe, from the Netherlands, Italy, and Bavaria in Germany. And oh my goodness, there's a website that details many of these star forts, and they show at least 340 or so of these star forts right across the globe. Now, it's thought that these star forts, not only were they harnessing energy, but they were configured in such a way as to create extremely healing frequencies for those who were living within the ambit of the star fort. And of course, if they had churches or cathedrals within those areas, then the spires of the cathedrals would be reaching up into the ether and drawing down energy. And it's thought that the metal poles sticking out of the top and sides of homes and other Tartarian buildings acted, in fact, as etheric electrical antennas, which harnessed the power of the ether and focused that free energy into the chimney. I'll come back to the chimney in a second, but sticking with the steeples of these incredible edifices, it's thought that the crosses on top of Tartarian buildings may have been used as etheric electrical antennas, which were connected to the rebar embedded throughout the building's structure. And around the cathedrals or churches, there would have been street lights that existed throughout the reign of the Tartarian Empire, tall etheric electrical antennae, which, like the steeples of the churches, harness the power of the ether. And in the case of the street lights, cause the gases inside of the upper bulb to ionize and fluoresce. Extraordinary stuff. Now, I mentioned fireplaces. Here are a couple of images of what may be Tartarian fireplaces. Enormous, as you can see. But as you ponder these images, notice that there's really no space within the fireplace for the burning of wood or coal, for that matter. No, on the contrary, the Tartarian fireplaces, it seems, were not designed to burn anything at all. By contrast, the metal backplating found inside of the fireplace and chimney was connected, like the steeple in the church, was connected to the rebar, the upper tower dome, and was connected also to outside metal poles, which concentrated the power of the ether and focused that free energy onto the metal backplate inside of the chimney, which ionized the air inside of that chimney. And that ionized air, coupled with the rising and falling of hot and cold air currents, created, it's thought, a pressurized electric vacuum inside of the chimney. And it had two effects depending on the season. During the winter, the chimneys acted as pressurized electric vacuums, radiating trapped heat inside of the chimney, out through the fireplace, and out through the metal sculptings and air ventilation ducts connected to the inside of the chimney. And then during the summer months, the process would simply reverse, and the fireplace and air ventilation ducts would suck in heat into the fireplace and air ducts, which were connected to the inside of the chimney from the inside of the house. And by way of the ionized air from the etheric electrically charged metal backplate inside of the chimney would force the heat up the chimney and out of the house. How wonderful. So these chimneys ensured generation of heat inside the house in the winter and the removal of excessive heat from the house during the summer. And if we cast our gaze up to the tops of churches and cathedrals, we often find that the steeples and domes are covered in copper. Why was that? Well, copper was absolutely vital, since it allowed the harvesting of magnetricity. And, well, you might be asking, what is magnetricity? And, well, this permits of the creation of a magnetic field that pulls and pushes electrons in certain objects closer to them, making them move. And metals like copper have electrons that are easily moved from their orbits. In fact, if you move a magnet quickly through a coil of copper wire, the electrons will move. And that movement will produce, wonder of wonders, electricity. So, yes, we find atop these incredible edifices, churches and cathedrals, copper. And as we've just seen, mercury. Mercury was also needed as well. And you just have to be astonished at the fact that these people had at their disposal vast sources of both mercury and also copper. And where did they get the mercury from? Well, all over the world, quite literally, from mines at Almaden in Spain, from Peru, and also from New Almaden in California. Just some of the places from which they source their mercury. And as for the copper, which we can still see resplendent today, according to American Indian oral tradition, copper was mined by red-haired, white-skinned marine men who came from across the sea. Well, it's thought that they may have been referring to men who'd come from Wisconsin near Lake Michigan. And here's a map which shows you Lake Michigan in the northeastern part of the United States. And this harnessing of energy from the ether allowed electricity to be produced on an industrial scale. But before we look at that, let's just think for a moment about the effects of this electricity, this energy coming down into churches and cathedrals. And it's difficult to be precise because this is an old technology which is no longer used. I regret to say, maybe we could revive it. But we have to imagine the combined effect of the frequencies from the building itself, we looked at those earlier, at the beautiful shapes that could be seen, the cymatic shapes that could be seen from simply the frequencies generated by the building. We have to imagine the combination of that along with the frequencies from the music, be it the music produced by choirs or by organs. And we have to imagine all of those frequencies in combination with energy frequencies generated by the towers and steeples and domes of the cathedrals and churches. And one can only imagine that the energy drawn down from the ether would have amplified those other frequencies that we've talked about. But returning now to the subject of electricity, we have very clear evidence of the industrial scale on which electricity was being generated when we go into the lobby of the Empire State Building, constructed in 1929. And I'll show you the extraordinary metal engraving that greets you in the lobby. Here it is now. And what you can see is in front of you the tall Empire State Building with a number of lines radiating out from the tower at the very top. And if you look closely at this engraving, you'll see the lines are marked with the names of a number of parts of the United States: Lake Ontario, Vermont, Buffalo, Albany, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And so it seems as though the tower, the Empire State Building Tower, was serving as an electricity generator and delivering electricity to those many parts of the United States. And I can't resist, while talking about the Empire State Building, from showing you yet another image of the Empire State Building, this time showing an airship landing atop the building. And yes, there are many old photographs showing airships landing at the tops of these skyscraper buildings. And you can probably see at the top there a kind of landing stage with a metal balustrade around it, I think. And so the passengers on these airships would disembark via that platform at the top and then presumably come down to street level via a lift. And note also that it's thought that these airships were running with free energy, and so transport may have been free in those days. And isn't it extraordinary to discover the fact that churches, cathedrals, synagogues may have been places of healing, not so much places of worship, and to also find out that the churches and cathedrals would have been drawing down free sources of energy. And so much history has, it seems, been concealed from us. And on that note, and still with energy in mind, just 2 slides on the pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids, and the materials that we find present in those pyramids. So first of all, granite. And we know that granite was used to line the passageways and underground tunnels of the pyramids. But the interesting question is why they were doing this. Well, granite contains high amounts of quartz crystal with metal and is a well-known conductor of piezoelectricity. How does it work? It works by ionizing the air inside the pyramid and creating a chemical reaction which increases the conductivity of electricity. So there we have it. These were not just places in which pharaohs could be buried. No, on the contrary, they may have been giant generator machines. And so valuable would this energy have been that, would you believe it, the granite that lined the passageways and underground tunnels was brought from a quarry in Aswan, 500 miles, that's 800 kilometers, distant from the pyramids, and equally astonishing, a massive 8,000 tons of granite were used in the Great Pyramid. And that's not all. Another material that was used on the inner surfaces of the pyramid was dolomite. And wonder of wonders, we find that dolomite increases the electrical conductivity relative to the amount of pressure on it, with high pressure creating more electrical current. So here we have a hidden aspect to history that embraces not only churches and cathedrals, but pyramids as well. These were all extraordinary edifices that could generate free sources of energy. And so we draw our talk to an end at this point, but there is so much more to discover. And if you're interested in joining us on this journey, then do join us at the Questioning Science and Media Conference this year, 2024, between the 14th and the 18th of August, up in the Peak District. And we have some very exciting speakers and presentations, spanning a whole range of subjects, from the glass ceiling in science. What is it that is being kept from us in scientific discoveries? And we have a talk on moving from 3D to 5D and how you can accelerate that process, and the separation process that may happen between people operating in these very different dimensions. I shall be exploring still further this issue of synagogues, churches and cathedrals as places of worship. And also with us at the conference, we'll have Stephen Denman, who will be taking us on a spiritual journey. He's very psychic and he'll share some of his psychic experiences with us. And because we're combining questioning science with questioning media this year, we have a media analyst explaining that increasingly small numbers of people are now paying attention to the mainstream media. So that's very interesting. It somewhat implies that what we're talking about in this talk here may at some point become mainstream. So if any of this excites your imagination, and there are more speakers, including Mark Devlin, coming to speak to us, then do get in touch by emailing learningholidays@protonmail.com. That's learningholidays@protonmail.com. And what else? We're running this event under the aegis of Truth University, a new university that focuses on the way that evidence-based critical thinking can guide us in the direction of new truths. And if you'd like to study with Truth University and conduct research of your own, if it's good enough, it will be published in the form of a book, and so it will be available as a new truth to beam out into the world. And if you're interested in that, then contact us again at either learningholidays@protonmail.com or at info truthuniversity@protonmail.com. That's info truthuniversity, all one word, @protonmail.com.